Welcome to People in AI, a new podcast exploring the forefront of artificial intelligence. I'm your host, Karthik Ramakrishnan, the CEO and co-founder of Armilla AI. Join us as we delve into AI's latest advances, ethical considerations, and the risks in this evolving technology. On today's episode, I'm very excited to have Marta Janczarski. Marta is a dynamic leader at the forefront of AI governance and standards development. We've been familiar with her work and her trajectory over the last decade or more. She's a recognized subject matter expert in data and AI, a respected strategist with expertise in management frameworks. She plays a leading role in developing the ISO standards, 42001 specifically, which we're going to spend a lot of time talking about today. And she's an advisor to various AI innovators, as well as the Canadian federal government working groups. She's a senior manager and a regulatory affairs specialist with significant experience in corporate and government affairs, leading and creating multifunctional strategies and teams on business development in emerging tech. She's also the chair of the ISO committee that's considering the standard. So we have the expert who will break down for us today how, as an organization, we should think about the ISO standard 42001 in respect to AI and the systems that we are now considering putting in various organizations. But without further ado, Marta, would love for you to introduce yourself in your own words, and would love to first maybe start with a quick journey on how you ended up at this intersection of AI, standards, corporations, and governance.
Thank you for having me. This is a great fun. I just want to, before we get into it, disclaim that this is my personal opinions and personal shared experiences, and I'm not representing any professional capacity today. First off, congratulations to Armilla AI on the seed funding. It's been a really, really great trajectory also to follow over the last few years and see that development and seeing that Canadian AI ecosystem continue to grow. And I'm looking forward to the next big adventures that you guys have to offer. I think it's a really interesting relationship between the concept of quality assessment and assurance that I think is most often dropped as we're having conversations in AI, and standards play an interesting role in that for sure. I think as anybody that develops standards will answer the question, we all kind of fell into it by accident. I don't think anybody sets out as their childhood dream to be a standards developer. But it's interesting. It's a really interesting intersection where you bring together your technical expertise, stakeholders that are very diverse, and be able to create the foundation infrastructure for a particular technology. I sort of went full circle where I started in compliance and regulatory affairs in pharma, where you were using certificates based on standards to show compliance for quality and efficiency and the chemical manufacturing process in pharmaceuticals. So particularly for new drugs, where you want to ensure that what is on the label has the same percentages within every single item in terms of how it's being manufactured, the quality, how it can rest stable over 6 months, 18 months. All that information that you have on the tin foil that if you do pause to read on a packet of tablets, all of that has to be proven. There's a certain level of assurance that you need, and you need to be able to prove it through a third party. So I thought it was really interesting when I was looking at it from the perspective of compiling all this to show this type of evidence, to then looking at how it's being developed, those controls and those requirements. I had the opportunity to join Standards Council of Canada. So the Crown Corporation, as it is in Canada, that oversees the participation in ISO and IAC, which is the major international standards developer, as a member participating on behalf of Canada. And it was interesting because I initially started as a health tech sector and reaching out to innovators and SMEs to get their perspectives in the standards development process. And of course, looking at it from an innovative perspective, the biggest standards gap was actually data analytics in that space. It was through those conversations where AI was also starting to have similar conversations on, well, how do we have any frameworks? What is ethical AI? And there was some sort of push towards, well, what are ethical reviews in the tech world? And quite a few of us in healthcare turned around and said, well, Yeah, like ethical reviews are part of innovation. Absolutely. You really can't start any process of R&D without having that as your foundation. So quality, management system standards, certifications, all of this is very thoroughly embedded. And so it's an interesting transition of that domain change, but the I guess the questions are the same. And so now being able to join back in industry as a standards developer and being the national standards officer at Microsoft Ireland, it's given me this wide purview to really jump deep into developing standards, both continuing at the international level, but also at the European specific level, which is a very interesting type of work because that is very connected to the regulatory mechanisms that the European Union has.
Oh, that's fascinating journey. But I think, as with anything else, right? These are very transferable concepts, right? From one domain to another, because ultimately the goal and the objectives are the same. Having quality assurance, knowing that, the technology, be it a pill or a AI system, and it's from something physical to something intangible. I think the same concept applies. So that's fascinating. And I'm joined here by Phil as well, who leads policy, is a head of policy at Armilla AI. I know he has a bunch of questions around, the standard, but maybe I could kick that off on the 42001 itself. What is this standard?
So 42001, with its full title, AI Management System Standard, is this foundational document which level set a series of base requirements for an organization looking to create, implement, deploy, procure AI systems. And the reason why it has this very specific title of Management System Standard is because it's actually based on a template of quality management systems. And so within the ISO world, we have a number of them. The generic one, which you'll see very often on sides of buildings and on the backs of your produce, is ISO 9001. And that really gives the most generic set of requirements for base level quality throughout an organization. Yeah. Over time, there are certain further management system standards that took a specific domain. So we have environmental management system standards, we have cybersecurity, and we have medical devices. And so what's been really interesting is that they all come back to that template style of base requirements of quality, because as we just discussed, at the end of the day, the concepts are still quite the same. Some of the high-level asks, they're domain agnostic. And then it gives an opportunity to have those specific add-ons that you'd be looking for that specific domain to then go one step further and make it very specific to cybersecurity, AI, medical devices. We had this idea to start looking at it back, I think, in 2019, 18, where we were really starting to get a lot of questions on what is quality in AI? What is assurance? There's no real validation testing methods that have been sort of globally accepted that are being deployed. We have a big range of academic projects happening in universities. We have SMEs that are developing their own ways of being able to justify the results that they're putting out. So it was a few experts from Canada that came together and said, this is ripe opportunity to be able to use what is a really already widely accepted base for quality and bring it into AI. And so we kicked off the work in 2020, so quite the pandemic project, and worked through it for about 3 years, which is standard, regular timeline for this size of document. And we went through that work stream of this is what your template quality requirements are, whether it's from your governance makeup in the organization, how your reporting structure works, whether it's reporting in terms of information flow, whether it's from reporting adverse events, incidents. Do you have SOPs for corrective protocols? Do you have the right level of oversight in terms of governance? what is your life cycle plan from, it's not just about R&D and getting it up and running, but what does your other half of the life cycle look like? So very big themes. And what we did is we went a step further. And in the annexes, we provided implementation guidance. So we're very aware that for those people that are working in AI, that are looking at risk in tech, there's still a lot of questions. This is still quite new. It's not an area that has had the same level of regulation as, for example, in manufacturing, where it is very clear what safety is, what level of assurances is needed. So these types of standards, they make part and parcel already. So we decided for the fact that realistically, a lot of organizations that would be looking at using the standard may not be familiar with this style of standard, with the style of QMS in general. And so there's an implementation guidance which gives some sort of leading questions of, okay, well, when we're speaking about this particular control, whether it's, for example, third-party relationships, these are some of the questions that you should be asking. And maybe not all of them are pertinent, right? There's different risk categories, but it gives that sense of that you're going through the right process and you're asking the right questions. What I will mention is that none of these standards operate alone. So while we have 9001, we have for quality, generically speaking, we have 27001, which is cybersecurity. They have additional standards to them because when you go through this type of standard, a lot of it will say, okay, well, depending on your impact assessment or depending on your risk management, this is where you need to show that these are being covered. So you will have families created around them. And right now we have the second one in tow, which is 42,005, which is impact assessment. Because then that gives you a huge part of, well, if you know where you're at that level, those implementation guidance questions are a lot easier to go through because you can map it a lot easier if they apply to you or not. What's nice is that this works with other existing AI risk management frameworks like the NIST one. And we are starting to see in that adoption process, even though this standard was just published December 18th, so still very, very, very new. There is already documents being published, such as the NIST AI Risk Management Framework Crosswalk 240-2001, which is a long-winded title of a document that basically shows how you can incorporate one and the other. The goal with a lot of these ISO standards is that they are as interoperable as possible. So ideally, they don't fit 100% one-stop shop for every single type of need you need when it comes to QMS. The idea is that they can fit in as many areas as possible to create that baseline foundation. So we do get a lot of questions around the standard of saying, okay, well, could I just get a certificate to that and then comply with the regulatory act? And that might be the case. That's still being discussed in a number of jurisdictions that are looking for that certification to be able to give themselves the assurance and compliance, something we don't have right now with GDPR. But at the same time, it's probably unlikely that all jurisdictions globally will have the exact same rules for compliance. We haven't seen that in any other approach. But usually there's a good baseline that's common. And so what we've seen in other industries is that they will use a management system standard as their base requirement, for example, and then it's a matter of plugging in what the additionals are. It's the same thing with procurement. I know regulatory takes up a lot of time right now, and of course it's very pertinent both in Canada and the EU and the US. Like there's quite a number of them, but what's really easy to say that ISO standards general fulfill the function for regulatory. It's only a piece of the puzzle. The procurement chain of the B2B contracts, of the entering into supply chains, a lot of those bids, if we look at it from even the cybersecurity world, they look at what kind of standards, protocols you have in place, right? Very few are going to do the detailed list of specs Ideally, they have it rolled up into a document they can reference. And it's huge, right? 27,001, even though it's not referenced in a regulatory act
Right.
in the world at the moment, it's a baseline for function to be able to work in that space.
Marta touches on a question I was going to ask you about the applicability of the ability of enterprises versus smaller vendors to implement the 42001. But before we get there, I wanted to maybe backtrack just a little bit because you started to unpack something that really has been my main interest. I think you know this, in following standards. And I think I'm choosing my words carefully because I'm kind of a fly on the wall in the ISO IEC SC42 committee as kind of a distant observer. And since you and I met, really been from a policy standpoint, a regulatory standpoint, kind of trying to keep track and make sense of the standards world, because as we're searching for answers, particularly from, how do you build regulations or how should businesses expect to comply with regulations? It just seems like this is an obvious place to look. And that's definitely the way it works in other sectors that you've mentioned, pharmaceuticals, aviation, a number of the other sectors that people are looking at to compare to for AI. So here's a question for you is, if I'm, you started to get into this, but if I'm looking at the regulatory, if I'm a large company, I'm looking at the regulatory landscape right now, it sounds almost like you're saying, 42001 is a good place for you to start.
What your perspective lens should be if you're looking at even engaging with developing whatever AI systems. And so what's nice is that the way these standards are, there's no minimum size requirement, right? In terms of being able to get certified to the standard, you could have a big multinational, you could have an SME. Obviously, it scopes to what the perspective is of the use, development, employee, like whatever angle you'd like to interact with when it comes to AI. And so I think just looking at how 27001 helped to shape that as well, because we were very much similar in that there was just a lot of ask for baseline. There was very specific security protocols that were very particular to different applications, to different settings and environments, but just kind of being able to take one step back and say, okay, the common denominator of themes that need to be addressed. And it seemed to work really well because you could plug in some of the more specific, very technical protocols and say, well, this fits in under this pillar, and be able to either build upon it or say that actually satisfies that request based on the risk that we've decided, we're operating in. So I think using that mentality for AI systems, I think it would be really beneficial because we're still grappling with a lot of these questions, and we've started to develop individual approaches. And I'd be really curious to hear particularly the insurance aspect that Armilla AI is looking at developing and where you guys are at in that process. But being able to plug in and say, okay, that actually covers this pillar of overarching QMS in an organization. And it gives a much better way to answer the question, is that sufficient enough? Right? Because at the end of the day, not having this organized, it almost doesn't even matter what the regulatory requirements are. The biggest half is always being able to say, proving that you do comply, right? And being able to organize succinctly the evidence and being able to communicate that to a regulator at large, right? Not familiar with the particular use cases of a particular market that you found your niche in.
We're, exactly the intersection in which Armilla finds itself. As we began this journey, over a year ago at this point, when I was reaching out to different notified bodies in the EU or standards bodies, one thing that I kept hearing again and again is that some of the biggest sources of questions they had were from the insurance community. They're just saying, we need to know what are the standards going to be for compliance with the EU AI Act, for good governance within corporations, for risk management, because this is really how we are going to be able to assess risk, quantify it, and decide whether or not to develop new insurance products or extend existing ones. So there's a really tight nexus, which isn't surprising in other industries, but also for AI with standards, assurance, compliance, and insurance. Recently, since 42001 has been, I think, discussed more and more in the last 3 to 6 months, we've also had enterprises asking us about this and say, okay, well, you're going to be performing our assessments. We know you have an insurance offering. Are you looking at 42001? And so it's been really interesting to be part of this kind of convergence in yet a new space where you have kind of almost another market-based incentive for the adoption of standards, which is insurance, which are an important proxy for risk because of the the risk mitigation that's built in and compliance as well. I have a good way to segue from whatever we were discussing into, I think, something you'll have views on, Karthik, and then especially curious to hear what Marta will think and the relevance of standards there. But okay, so as Armilla is doing its work and keeping track of the standards and having discussions with clients, I think we still see a major gap that's outstanding that you touched on earlier, Marta, which is really around some of the testing validation standards for machine learning systems and common approaches for testing, for measuring performance, for measuring fairness, even guidance around the selection of metrics that are relevant in a particular domain or robustness. And I know that there's already ISO documents on this, technical reports, especially. But I think this is a place where we still see, from a risk assessment perspective, even in the ability to provide a warranty as Armilla, big gaps for standard approaches that I'm not sure that 42001 addresses itself. So I just wondered what you think about that. And I think this is also quite relevant from an enterprise's risk management standpoint, from a compliance standpoint, and of course from an insurance standpoint. There could be an argument that some adherence to some of these standards, at least today, we know there's some coming, the work is not finished, but can give false confidence in either a conformity assessment against a standard or compliance under the EU AI Act, for instance, can give false confidence in actual risk mitigation because an unsolved problem is really around the testing and validation of models.
To your point on some of the testing, validation, robustness, I think we've come a long way of understanding their place in a general quality, trustworthy approach. And I think being able to map that to a QMS is really important because to my previous, like when we previously explained about being able to know which of the pillars to put it under is part of your double check, effectively saying, is actually that enough? Are we doing enough work comparing to our risk assessment, to our impact assessment, and whether we're actually applying the right one? I think, in terms of the false confidence aspect, the fact that you have a 40001 certification is part of the job, but at the same time, you could say, well, I'm doing these types of validation studies and assessments, but if they're not actually properly chosen for that level of risk, well, then that also would be, a false confidence and saying, well, I've got a check mark of some sort, but it's not actually linking to the overarching approach that you have as an organization. And I think one of the big risks when you're looking at whether it's robustness or bias is that at this moment, a lot of the approaches are very limited to a certain application. And of course, that's really important because there's going to be the differentiation in applications, which is going to give you the similar diversity of protocols that we see in privacy and security. But being able to have that mapped is, I think, the key. And I think particularly if we're looking at some of those requests when it comes to the EU AI Act, being able to have something to certify to. I think you mentioned on the fact that a lot of these documents exist as technical reports or are still in development, there's definitely that gap in link to be able to say that there's conformity. And I think that is also a big differentiator with 40001, which it's not about having a self-assessment. It's not about having an independent small organization located in one jurisdiction, applying this type of standard. They're in conjunction, and again, I'm referring to that family of standards, in conjunction with 40001, there's actually a standard about the requirements of an auditor to be able to actually do a proper audit of this standard. That standard is 42006, should be published by mid this year. And that's when you're looking at whether it's national bodies or notified bodies, when you're looking at some of the accreditation bodies in a variety of different countries.
I think one of the questions we would have, so if you're an organization, so you've got multiple standards now, right? So you've got ISO, you've got the NIST, we have Standards Council of Canada coming up with something, you've got the BSI in the UK, you've got VDE in Europe. And so there's many standards bodies now. And they're all considering some type of AI governance frameworks and AI standardization practices. So if I'm an organization, how should I be thinking about these various standards and what should I be applying?
Yeah, so just for the clarity, when you're looking at Standards Council of Canada or BSI, ANSI in the US, AFNOR in France, they're the ones bringing the ISO standards into that country. So just before we look at it from a multiplication standpoint, so SCC would go forward, for example, with an adoption of ISO IEC 40001. We've had that happen in the EU, where 40001 has gone through ballot to become a European norm. So it has that addition of saying it's gone through a localized assessment that this is still useful for us. So there might be modifications or amendments, additions around the world to say, okay, as we mentioned before, for our jurisdictions, we want something extra that gives it a full full-bodied approach for what we see fit. But again, it's that foundation base of ISO IEC that would be used. And we see that particularly being adopted extensively right now in Korea, as well as in Japan, where they are very focused on having at least organizations starting to be extremely aware of 40001, because they're very aware of the fact that once that certification becomes available with auditors, they will have at least something, a common denominator, something that is interoperable that they can communicate with, either within their existing industries or particularly when they're looking at international markets. When you're looking at some of the other standards development bodies you've mentioned, such as the AI Risk Management Framework from NIST, it is a framework, so it's something that would need to be incorporated into a standard, such as AIMS, but it gives, there's that distinction of documents that are good for reference to protocols and then actual certifications. So I think you'll see that package of different products that will help. And I mean, I think it's also a matter of starting that prep work. I think when organizations see all these different and are not sure where to start, having that impact assessment, right? Like I think at the end of the day, understanding your risk levels is what will help to understand what level of assurance you will need. And particularly when we're talking about AI, I know we like to talk about it in this horizontal, almost sometimes vacuum, but it's going to operate in existing verticals, which have existing requirements for risk management, have existing standards already that would need to be integrated.
That's great. And from an organization standpoint, I think I think you're already alluding to this. Many organizations, especially in regulated industries, have established and mature risk management and compliance teams, right? And so for them, it's clear. I think they would be following these standards, particularly if I'm in the procurement team, right? I should be asking, hey, have you got yourself conformed to this particular standard, just as I would with any other technology from a cyber standpoint, right? I would say, hey, yes, do you have your SOC 2 compliance in place? Have you got it checked? Or do you have your ISO 27,000, checkbox? And it kind of accelerates, right? So there's a common language that we can speak and accelerates sort of that trust building on that particular software. So I think this is all fantastic. But I'm going to go back to what Phil asked earlier, right? As a large organization, I'm mature, I know this stuff. As a SME or even as a vendor, most of the AI companies today, right, barring the large technology companies that are incorporating AI into their existing products, we have a lot of startups coming to the fray. How should they be thinking about, especially if they're B2B businesses, and even if they're not, even if they're just consumer-focused applications, how should they be incorporating and thinking about, for 2001?
The idea of having SMEs who don't have necessarily the experience, maybe even the resources at this point in time to be looking at it on such a wide scope. This is where we think, and it really came out of the discussions in SC42 of that committee that did develop 40,001, where there needs to be as much guidance and support into this document because it's foundational, because it's directional, it'll give you the right questions to prompt possible further deep dives. Not only do we have this annex of implementation guidance with those questions, with management system standards, there's very often handbooks developed for SMEs. And these are handbooks where they all have a bit of a similar sense of, okay, this is this new world of organizational governance. And these are how this comes into play on a small scale. And so I would imagine that would be very much something that is being considered now as a next step to be able to, again, help that family to that wide audience, to be able to include and onboard, as you said, SMEs who not particularly sure where to start, don't necessarily know how to jump all in all at once. But this gives them that starting position of, okay, let's divide this into something manageable so we can at least identify what the resources are necessary, right? And in terms of being able to better communicate what their needs might be.
Yeah, Marta, I think that's a great message for people listening, particularly if they're startups or vendors selling AI-powered products, looking to sell internationally. There's just to know that there's the standard, there's guidance, and then even at a level lower, there could be handbooks developed, maybe even for specific industries. And, some of that is being funded by the national standards bodies, right? As part of their innovation programs, whether it's, BSI or SEC or ANSI, just I know I'm more familiar with the programming in Canada, but the Standards Council of Canada itself has some funding for exactly these types of purposes, right? And if memory serves me correct, I think that you were part of those early programs and proposals, right?
We saw a lot of success when I initially joined at looking at very specific industry verticals and being able to take those lessons learned and create this program more towards data governance and AI. And that was sort of my last chapter at SEC, to be able to create those programs and apply for those funding, to be able to have a partner in the federal government with that. I'm really happy to see the other side and those projects now start to flow from those initiatives. So absolutely, it'll help to then be able to bring to light what the right needs are, because there are so many questions. And it's interesting because when we started this in 2020, there were a lot of questions of, is this the right time? Are we ready yet? Do we have enough idea about assurance and AI to be able to start putting pen to paper? And the amount of questions we get now of like, well, where's the rest? How can we have, looked at all these aspects and like, what about like this happening this year? Let alone, walking into what generative AI means for the standards world and the requirements there. So we're getting there. It's definitely under development. These documents are written to be able to withstand a certain test of time. And so as much as we're all excited to get something, out the door and ready now, just as much as there's excitement with regulatory frameworks being, good to go and deployed, the time to get this right, I think, will be the more time efficient way of going forward.
Yeah, no, awesome. And you brought this up a number of times, right? The corollary with what's happened in cyber is sort of what's happening with it. That story is playing out with AI, right? From technology, now you've got standards, you've got certifications, and then you have cyber insurance, right? Because you can put in all the best practices in place. You can have your firewalls, you can have your checks on securing your systems in every single way possible. But there is a residual risk in all of that, right? And that when you've done everything right and you've got that residual risk, that's when insurance steps in to say, okay, look, if you've complied with the standards and you've done the right things, then we can step in and protect you should anything go wrong despite that, right? And that's where, how we're thinking about this as well, right? And so we've now got, in the world of cyber, security and cyber assurance, a number of companies that now go and assess and assure and conduct these audits, right? So you're in compliance with either an ISO standard or a SOC 2 compliance, but also going above and beyond and ensuring that, helping you remediate should they find any issues. I think that industry has to grow for AI as well, right? And that's going to help both startups, but also large enterprises. And then something like the 42001 has set a common language across these stakeholders. I think that's where we think it's taken a while in coming, but it's pretty interesting that it's coming at the same time with the draft EU legislation also came to sort of the fore towards the end of last year. So it's very encouraging. Maybe a question here is, how does this framework and these standards keep up with the evolution of AI? Like ChatGPT, the frenzy of AI, let's put it this way, it's been building up over the years, but last year it reached kind of peak hype, I would say, right? With ChatGPT and OpenAI and all the attention there. And it's continuing on. Hurrah, awesome. I think we all need to start adopting AI at scale because it's going to have a lot of benefits. But how do these standards keep up?
These standards are all in life cycle. So even if we had no new innovations, weirdly enough, in the AI space from here on in, they have to get reviewed at a minimum of every 3 years. Even if it's just to say, we're all good, we can continue sailing as is. If there's something very pivotal that changes, there are ways of having amendments and being able to have that flexibility, being able to have almost 46 countries looking at this with all their stakeholders and committees nationally that are feeding into the international process. We have a really good diversity of voices. They should continue to grow and become continuously more diverse as we see these applications grow. There's, definitely the invite there. But then additionally to that, when we're looking at generative AI, ChatGPT, yes, it is very different in terms of what we're seeing, what possibilities we have. But if we think about it, it still needs the right approach to the design and the development, the right level of testing, evaluation of what kind of impact it's going to have, how you're actually governing its maintenance, how are you doing your evaluation of those maintenance reviews, how are you looking at improvements in that. So at the end of the day, the idea of having basic governance, it's steadfast. So having that document that looks at it, those foundational questions of AI, helps us to, even if we have, as you said, next year, yet another big pivotal shift, it gives us the framework and a lens to look at it through. And it gives a little bit more clarity and hopefully a little bit less risk inadvertently, because we have already the right pillars in which we can place our questions and apply it to whatever new application, new innovation we have. So does it solve everything? No, because those questions still obviously need to be answered. But just having your thoughts organized almost at the end of the day makes that much easier to process.
If I can, and I know we're getting to the end of our time here, but I do want to ask you a question. I think it ties together your work on 2001 with the last little bit of our conversation with discussions around AI safety and the new initiatives at NIST around the AI safety institutes that are kind of popping up all over, the consortium that was just announced, and other industry initiatives that some of which Microsoft are a part of, like the Frontier Model Forum. But how does traditional standard development through something like ISO 42001 or other standards that are coming up, how might those be relevant to these current conversations?
I can't say I'm fully up to speed just based on the sheer volume of what's been going on in the US in regards to that. But the conversation around assessments, in particular when it comes to safety, isn't new. And based on what I've seen in the past, it's always been multifaceted. And at the end of the day, usually a concept of safety pulls from a variety of different directions to be able to fit that high umbrella. I think having certifications is something definitely for consideration. I'm not particularly sure what their objectives are or what their actual outputs they've sort of assigned to those particular, whether it's the forums and the initiatives that are ongoing at the moment. But they're very well aware and they're very well connected to standards development work, both at ISO-IEC, as well as, of course, the EU, US forums of conversation and information sharing. So none of these initiatives are being developed in silos.
Marta, thank you so much. You've been so generous with your time, and this is insightful. I think this is going to be really useful for organizations to have the absorb. But we do a lot of work across both large enterprise